This is Laura London, and you're listening to Speaking of Jung. Joining us today for episode 82 is John Ryan Haule in Brookline, Massachusetts. On his way to an early morning organic chemistry class one day in the early 1960s, he had a brief, life-transforming religious experience. Having been raised Catholic, he interpreted the event in Christian terms and, after graduation, entered a religious order. There, he encountered Jung's writings and became convinced that there was nothing distinctively Christian about his experience. It was simply human and archetypal. After 5 years, he left the order and went on to earn a doctorate in religious studies from Temple University. His dissertation was on Jung and Martin Heidegger, titled Imagination and Myth, a Heideggerian Interpretation of C.G. Jung. He then taught in the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Northeastern University for 3 years, before heading to Switzerland, where he underwent analytic training at the original C.G. Jung Institute in Zürich. Dr. Haule is past president of the New England Society of Jungian Analysts and of the C.G. Jung Institute Boston, and is a former member of the Executive Committee of the International Association for Analytical Psychology. Currently, he is a guest lecturer at the C.G. Jung Institute in Küsnacht, where his most recent lecture, Portraits of Depression, was presented during their 2021 winter block. He is the author of The Love Cure, Therapy Erotic and Sexual, Perils of the Soul, Ancient Wisdom and the New Age, The Ecstasies of St. Francis, The Way of Lady Poverty, Divine Madness, Archetypes of Romantic Love, Jung in the 21st Century, Volume 1, Evolution and Archetype, and Volume 2, Synchronicity in Science, and Tantra and Erotic Trance, Volume 1, Outer Work, and Volume 2, Inner Work. His essay, Jung Comes Back to Himself, Reflections on the Connections Between the Red Book and Gnosticism, was published in Volume 4 of Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions. In this episode, the first in a series, we will be focusing on Dr. Haule's early work. Please visit the website speakingofjung.com, where you will find links to everything discussed in this episode in the show notes. This interview is being recorded on Monday, March 8th, 2021, through the magic of Skype. Thanks so much for joining us today, Dr. Haule.
Glad to be here.
I'd like to start with your background, because this story that I read in the intro about you having a brief, life-transforming religious experience is really important to set the scene for what we're going to be talking about today and what I'm going to be covering on this podcast in the months to come. Especially you having been raised Catholic, as I was, and you interpreted the event in Christian terms. So, would you pick it up from there?
Well, the message was silent, but it was very, very clear. I was walking along a Livernois Avenue in Detroit, passing one used car lot after another. And suddenly I looked up and I felt that I rose up off the sidewalk by about 2 inches, and I kept moving. And I suddenly knew that there was something real about the spiritual world. And it also let me know that I had been barking up the wrong tree in what I was striving for, trying to get decent grades and thinking of my future in terms of, how I might earn a living and so forth, and feeling very inadequate in all those ways. I got the clear indication that that wasn't the important thing. And further, it didn't go further than that. It ended. I continued on to class and kept it within me for about 50 years before I finally dared to speak of it openly. And I think that's always a good a good thing that for a person who has an experience that other people wouldn't understand, don't talk about it until you're ready.
So that affected you, and you were in college at the time. And
yes.
After you graduated from college, you weren't planning on entering a religious order, right?
I was planning on going to medical school.
Okay. But instead...
But I felt like if I go to medical school, I may never pay attention to this experience I've had, and I certainly have no right to ignore it. Mm-hmm. And so probably what I'm going to be doing is talking to people about what's real and what isn't, and what kind of experiences you might have along the course of life, and somehow or other get across from them the urgency of the message that I got, that the spiritual world is real.
And was it an isolated incident that you had?
Yes, I never had another one like it.
But it was powerful enough to alter the course of your life, really.
Yeah, it did. It certainly did. There have been, I'm not willing to go into them, but there have been other experiences where I know it was just, that first experience was just hinted at as a reminder of staying on track.
You spent 5 years in kind of a monastery-like setting, right? And then
that's right.
You decided, right. So then you decided to enter the doctorate program at Temple University. What did you study there?
Oh, I studied Jung and philosophy, and the professors thought that probably I was too scattered in the things that I was studying. But I was studying things that I thought related to the calling I had felt that I had. And so I took a wide variety of courses.
You mentioned that you found Jung's writings when you were in school. And for your dissertation, you connected Jung and Heidegger. Would you tell us a little bit about the connection between the two?
Well, one thing is, starting out, when I was in the monastery-like setting, one of the most important things going on in the Catholic world at that time was that Thomas Aquinas, who was always the philosopher of Catholicism, was being sort of supplanted by existential psychology. And the most prestigious of those figures was Martin Heidegger. And I enjoyed reading Martin Heidegger and felt that he was speaking a similar language, and he was talking about, particularly in his very famous first book, Being and Time, he was talking about living an authentic life. And that was certainly something that I was interested in doing. And it was what I felt Jung's message to us all has been. You know, if you live in harmony with yourself, you really are living the life of, you've integrated spiritual values and the ordinary events of your life, and have reached a point of a certain amount of certainty in what you're doing, that it isn't following rules set down somehow outside in the world, but they're rules that make themselves clear internally.
Why do you think it's so difficult for us today to live an authentic life?
Wow, I don't know. Offhand, I don't have a thesis to tell us about that.
Do you think it's something that most of us are struggling with?
Probably at some level, many of us are struggling with it. Many probably believe they've given up on it because it's slowing them down in life. It's really hard to know that you're on the right track. And I had my message certainly was, you're on the wrong track now, but don't worry about it. We have plans for you.
That was what you were hearing internally?
That was an internal, that was the voice of I've never spoken that before. Mm-hmm. And I know, it seemed like it was an appropriate thing to say here to make clear where I stand. But,
I think a lot of the listeners will totally relate to that. And what my question is, who is the we? You said we have plans for you, and I know a lot of listeners will be able to relate to that. And I often wonder who this we is.
Yeah, I would say that my experience was I encountered a one, not many.
Okay.
And but we is a sort of neutral term. Mm-hmm. I don't know why it came out of me then, but certainly one is encountering obstacles and encouragements along one's course in life all along. And one could think that these are contributions of different, maybe spiritual figures. Who knows? Mm-hmm. I mean, they don't appear as spiritual figures to me. I haven't had any more experiences like the first one.
I want to make sure we finished covering Heidegger, which you wrote an entire thesis about it, and I spoke about it for a couple minutes there. But a Heideggerian interpretation of C.G. Jung. Would you tell us a little bit about his interpretation of Jung?
First of all, I don't think he had an interpretation of Jung. As far as I know, he didn't know that Jung existed. And Jung also had nothing to say about Heidegger that I was aware of.
Okay.
At the time that I wrote the dissertation, the first volume of Jung's letters had come out, and I was awaiting the second bound of letters. And in the second one, a philosophy student wrote to him and spoke of Martin Heidegger. Mm-hmm. And Jung basically blew it all off and said that Heidegger was one of those absurd, crazy philosophers these days who speak nonsense that no one can understand. So all that told me was that Jung hadn't read Heidegger the way I had. Mm-hmm. I thought what Heidegger was trying to do was to express things in an existential manner, a manner that had to do with time, for one thing, that we're living in time, that we where we are now is emerged out of our past, and we're now facing a future. And how we deal with these things is the important thing. There are, for example, existential psychologists who work very much along the lines of paying attention to the temporality of the person who's studying, who's before them. Mm-hmm. And, for example, one finds that people who are depressed, for example, very frequently are obsessed with changing the past, something that cannot be done. You can only change the future. And so there's a sense of understanding how people are missing the point in terms of how they relate to time and how they relate to the encouragements in a way that they're getting in the course of their life. Mm-hmm. From ordinary events.
You wrote a book, which I'd like to get into right now. I found it fascinating. It's called The Ecstasies of St. Francis, The Way of Lady Poverty. Mm-hmm. And in the book, you are asking, what was Francis? And you refer to him in the book as Francis because obviously he wasn't a saint while he was alive. So you say it asks, what was Francis doing and how did he do it? And that he became who he was by experimenting with his awareness. And he's such a fascinating figure. And you also bring in the topic of narcissism. So I'd like for you to tell us, first of all, what was the impetus for you even writing this book?
Well, first of all, I should tell you that I never had any respect for Saint Francis.
Okay.
For he always seemed to be he's always presented as a sort of child who was talking to the birds and other animals, and there wasn't anything realistic about him. And if you saw him in a movie or something like that, he was always a childish figure that you had to love. But there wasn't much substance to them. There wasn't a foundation. And I just happened to come across, I'm a sort of a fan of opera. I came across an opera on St. Francis by the contemporary French composer Olivier Messiaen. And when I listened to the music, by the way, Messiaen is also an ornithologist and collects birdsong and uses his birdsong in his composing music for humans. And what I heard in his opera was something that was so startling, so conflicted, and yet so deep and promising in another sense, that I thought, wow, this Messiaen has encountered a different Francis than I know, and I better find out who he is. And so I began looking for interviews with Messiaen that I could read, and what I found out was that there is a big, thick volume of what they call legends, stories that were meant to be read because there weren't that many people literate back in the 11th, 12th century. And, the point was that all of these stories gave us a picture of a saintly figure. There's no doubt about that. Mm-hmm. There's no other knowledge we have about Francis. So I felt I could master the life of Francis as presented in these stories, biographies that came out of nowhere, came out of the people who believed in him back in the 12th, 13th centuries. So by reading that, I discovered that, first of all, he was a very narcissistic individual. And when I say narcissistic, I mean narcissism has to do with having a foundation within, what Jung would call a self. Mm-hmm. And the narcissist is usually a person who has no confidence internally in himself. And what he strives to do, or she strives to do, is to win the affection of the people around them. Mm-hmm. And if they get praise from the people around them, that's good enough. But it doesn't really satisfy what they're looking for. So this was Francis. He was his dad was an early member of the mercantile class, making money by trading. In his case, trading fabrics, I believe, primarily. Anyway, he was earning a lot of money, and Francis was spending that money to dress himself up in the clothing of knights and pretend that he was a knight, or having big parties with his friends and impress them with all of the fancy wines and food that he could prevent them all. He was looking for their praise. He was looking for praise everywhere until he heard a voice from God saying, "Take care of my church," or "repair my church," or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. And so he began using his father's the money he got from selling his father's materials, his fabrics, and using it to fix an actual church building.
So he listened to the voice. He didn't ignore
He listened to the voice in a certain way, but it wasn't his money that he was giving to that church, and it wasn't the church with a big C. It was a rundown little church, and building, and so he got in trouble. His father went after him on that, and he ran to the bishop to get freedom, to get protection from his father. And eventually, in the process of their negotiation, he said he had wanted to have nothing to do with his father, and he would pay back the money that he had stolen from his father. And that began his life of begging. And how that fit into narcissism was it was humiliating for him to beg.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that he would be doing the very things that exposed that narcissistic core of his being, that the part of him that he was most unhappy with and ashamed of. Begging for materials for himself, yes, if he needed anything, but by and large he didn't need anything. He gave everything that was given to him to people whom he perceived as needing a jacket or shoes or whatever it was.
Did he do that for himself because he wanted to be kind of the hero by providing people who were needy with things? I mean, I'm just trying to understand why he would do that, why somebody as narcissistic as Francis would want to help other people.
Well, he developed, the thing that was remarkable about him was that he established a relationship with his narcissism.
Mm.
He took it that every time he had a narcissistic impulse, for example, it came into him, the kind of thing that happened right at the beginning of his begging life. He goes to an establishment, a house, maybe a small castle, I don't know what it was, where he thought he would beg some money that he could give to the poor. But as he got close to the building, he saw there were people about his own age milling about, and he had to get by them, and they wanted an explanation of what he was doing. So he had to tell them that he was going to beg from the people in the house, and of course they all laughed at him, and he felt terrible about it. He started walking away, having given up the project, and then he said, no, he has to do it. And what he discovered was when he did the thing he knew was the right thing to do, especially the thing that humiliated him, if he could propel himself through that incident as calmly as possible, even though he was dying in the process of it, what happened was he changed his consciousness, and he began to live in the world that he knew from the New Testament, where we find Jesus everywhere he's going. He's preaching to the people that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. We are living now in the world that is potentially the kingdom of heaven. We just have to open our eyes and see it and live in it. So Francis felt he was living in the kingdom of heaven, the very thing that he was meant to do as a Christian, and that he'd never figured out how to do. So moving into humiliation was always the way that he saw forward into a clarity, a feeling of triumph, and not a triumph that he did, but rather much more a triumph that Christ was doing through him as he worked at begging clothing, food, and money to give to the poor.
So he just sort of realized these things naturally, or was he being guided in some way?
I don't think there's any evidence that someone was guiding him to this particular practice. Actually, the Catholic Church was horrified by the process, but he knew that this really was a spiritual life. And he knew that he was called to live it. So you might say he must have had an experience not unlike the one that I had,
right,
that told me that there was a way I could go forward that was going to accomplish something on another plane. And so that was what he was doing there, and he had the reward of having succeeded. He had the reward of having stepped out of this petty world into the spiritual world that Christ was preaching.
And just to give the listeners who are not familiar with his life a little bit of perspective, he lived from the years 1186 to 1226. So he only lived for 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
And
he destroyed his health he referred to his body as Brother Ass.
Ass.
Brother Ass. And so all kinds of punishments could be dealt to Brother Ass. And he felt that was a spiritual way to go. By the end of it, and that was not an unusual thing for saints in the history of Catholicism to believe, and to in the end have really ruined their health and die young. So this was definitely true of Francis. Well before the end of his life, though, he realized that he was shortening his life by the way he was giving himself penances and trying to tame his brother Ass, whom he thought was simply interested in following his impulses. And so he probably knows himself better than we do. Probably he was. But by the end, he realized that Brother Ass was the only way that he could carry on doing his work. And he had undermined Brother Ass's life by giving him too much penance, I guess we could say.
The subtitle of the book is The Way of Lady Poverty. So what was his relationship with Lady Poverty? Who was she?
Well, she was his image of the person that understood his life, who understood what he was doing with his begging. He would get up in the middle of something that was going on. He would get up and go out and beg for a while, because he felt like he needed the spiritual nourishment he got from begging. And I would say, therefore, she's the embodiment of the spiritual nourishment that he got from begging. Mm-hmm. There was almost what you could call an eros, an erotic quality to it. That is to say, he was drawn to her in a very powerful way. She wasn't the pseudonym for a real woman. She was the personification of his aspirations, you might say. And in the famous painting in a church that was built and dedicated precisely to Saint Francis, there's a picture of him being wed to Lady Poverty. And if you look at the cover of the book that was published, my book on St. Francis, yes, you see that it is that very painting on the cover, the wedding between Francis and Lady Poverty.
And I will have that book cover on the episode page for this episode 82, on the speakingofjung.com website. You can see the book cover there. So when you say that he became who he was by experimenting with his awareness, he also it resulted in him learning several techniques for entering ecstatic states of consciousness. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot more going on with him and his stigmata. So what were these ecstatic states of consciousness that he experienced?
I would say that idea of going into his shame in order to enter the world of that is the kingdom of heaven on earth. That was certainly everything he did along those lines was follow whatever you said there.
The ecstatic states.
The ecstatic phrase, yes. And so he did that. When he would beg food, in the beginning he did it all himself, but eventually he had followers. He had lots of followers.
Why? What were people drawn to?
There was something about him and his connectedness to the world and to people that that spoke volumes, I guess, for who he was. And so so the people who were following him were aspiring to live the kind of life he lived. Mm-hmm. And he realized that they could only do that if they really experimented with it. So he would send, for example, some of his people into a town as they're walking along the roads of northern Italy. They may have stopped at a certain place, and he may have chosen 2 or 3 people to go into that town and beg some food for them. And he would choose those people precisely in a way that they could strengthen their faith. He wouldn't let them do it until he was convinced that they were founded deeply enough in what Jung would call their self, and so that they could go ahead and face up to the humiliation that inevitably they would feel as they begged food for their leader. And another thing he would do was, as they were walking along, he would ask one person after another to speak, not to speak something that he had prepared previously, but to speak spontaneously what he was moved to say. Actually, as it were, what the Holy Spirit wanted to speak through him. Mm. And as you can imagine, you can only do that if you're doing something that's truly authentic. He had an ear for hearing that, and as soon as the follower got to the point of speaking spontaneously, he'd say, "Okay, that's enough," and gave the nod to another of his followers to try to do the same. And so it was the whole point of it was, there's no point in preaching unless the Spirit has something to say through you. And so that if he were invited to speak at a certain gathering, if words didn't come to him, he wouldn't say a word. He would just stand there in his shame at not being able to come up with something.
Mm. So now, I mentioned ecstatic states of consciousness, and I guess what I was really getting at are, in chapter 6, you talk about his powers: predicting the future, reading the secrets of others' hearts, bilocations, exorcisms, and other external battles with the devil, astounding and sudden healings, and a peculiar power over animals. So where did all of that come from?
That came from those legends of St. Francis that I spoke of earlier. A big fat book.
Yeah, would you say that those are all true, that they actually happened?
What I would say about them is that they are really the truth of what people believed about Francis. Mm-hmm. And I say that in the book. I don't say in the book, these are the things that Francis, the historical Francis, did. I said, the only Francis we have is the Francis of legend.
Right.
In fact, the situation is pretty much the same as Jesus. We don't have anything about Jesus except what people remembered about him. And those are the Gospels and the other parts of the New Testament.
So now, as a psychologist, how do you look at this? I'm curious, because this is something that has fascinated me my whole life. As I said, I was raised Catholic as well, and I've always had a deep interest in saints. And I've been to Rome and the Vatican and Chimayo in New Mexico, and I often wonder, something else I wanted to mention is the stigmata. So from what I understand, it's very rare to see St. Francis, either in paintings or in statues, depicted with the stigmata. And there is a very large cathedral in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where before lockdown I used to visit several times a year for many, many years. And there is a gigantic, bigger than life-size statue of St. Francis of Assisi outside on the side of this cathedral, with his palms turned upward, depicting the stigmata. So I've always been very curious from a psychological perspective. Is this real? And then that opens a whole other can of worms, is what is real? Mm-hmm. But would you tell us something about that phenomenon?
Well, I'll tell you this, that I read some material on, I searched the library for material on whether something like that is possible. And I kind of came to the conclusion that there are a variety of views on the thing, but that it's probably possible under the right circumstances. Mm-hmm. And the right circumstances, I think he was one of the first to bear the stigmata. Mm-hmm. And there are people, it's pretty much limited to Catholics, but not entirely, to develop the bleeding, an identification with Christ, I guess. Yeah, so that was, my impression was that the stories depicted him primarily trying not to show off, not showing his stigmata to the people that might want to follow him or something like that. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I can say more about the stigmata part of it, except that it seems as though for some people it does happen. And you could imagine that the psyche is powerful enough to do lots of things.
Right. Another topic in the book, in chapter 6, you talk about in India these perfect powers called siddhis. How does that factor in to this story?
Well, it factors in because we might call the powers that Francis has in terms of influencing people, in terms of manifesting his own state of being, and all of these things and even communicating with animals. Mm-hmm. I can easily believe communicating with animals was a trait of his, because it is possible to communicate with animals.
Right.
And I think people are getting to know that more and more. I see more and more documentaries, for example, with people who have learned how to communicate with horses or with bears or various kinds of animals. One discovers a certain comradeship or fellow creature quality between the human and the animal. Anyway, the siddhis are special powers that are given, and it is generally said that if you're on the spiritual path, there will come a time when you begin to manifest siddhis, these special powers. Mm-hmm. And this is the way your last test, because people become so impressed with the siddhis that they just want to manifest the siddhis or
right.
see them manifested before them. And if you do that, you've lost your way along the path. You have to set them aside.
For the listeners who are not familiar with the term, it's spelled siddhis for plural, and they include occult powers, mind reading, clairvoyance, materialization, levitation, making things invisible, and actually entering other bodies. And so you're saying that with spiritual practice, deep spiritual practice, they come naturally. Eventually.
That's what I understand.
Yeah.
I can't tell you that I've had siddhis and know exactly what they're talking about, but there's a pretty consistent story told by Hindus and others that the siddhis are real, and they're not something so much to be sought for as mm-hmm. to be strong enough not to be misled by. In other words, if I try to show you that I'm more powerful than you because I can perform one of these siddhis, I've lost my way. I'm now into narcissism, you might say, mm-hmm. Manifesting, trying to win friends by impressing them with my powers.
Right. And St. Francis, or Francis, I should say, he didn't do that, which I'm trying to understand. So you say that the central discovery that he made was that the very tender narcissistic sector of his psyche held the secret.
Yeah.
And so when he started developing these things, he wasn't saying, look at me, which a narcissistic individual would do.
No, he wasn't. what I'd like to say here is that the secret behind my writing the book about St. Francis is St. Francis seems to have learned a very important lesson based in the experience of narcissism. And so, in a way, to find out that someone can live with narcissism and live with it creatively and live it transformatively,
yeah,
that's really something. Because for the most part, psychologists talk about narcissism as one of the most difficult traits to overcome. And nobody wants to be narcissistic. Almost everybody is narcissistic, at least at one time or another. And so to find out the humility that was brought on by Francis's the shame before demonstrating his begging powers, you might say. He got no positive feedback from that, except that he was able to take clothing and food and money from wealthy people to poor people, and help them in their poverty. But so this was the first case I had ever seen of someone living their narcissism in a creative way, in a transformative way. So that was really the thing that I was really interested in, but I just told the story. I let you draw your own conclusions about what you think about Francis and what he was doing.
And you said by standing firm in this emotional tumult, he discovered a portal onto an alternate universe, which he saw as the kingdom of God that Jesus of Nazareth had come to preach.
That describes pretty well what I was trying to do, what I saw in him. And, I didn't run that by any Franciscans. I had no idea whether there'd be any, response from the Franciscan community. And, it turns out there was at least one. There's, I guess my publishers must have shown parts of the text to, a number of people, and, a couple of people came through with a little blurb for the back cover of the book. One from a fairly well-known Franciscan who said that he thought he'd seen all the biographies of Francis that could ever exist, and then along comes another one that was truly original, namely mine. And so, I feel like I'm onto something. I'm onto something that was true about St. Francis and something that's true about us all if we only dare to face up to it.
And how do we do that? By paying attention to our inner life?
By paying attention to our inner life, we might notice what happens when next time you're in a position of shame in terms of how you can handle it. There's a lot that goes on there, and I think that Francis got his followers in the beginning by teaching them his method and coaching them in his method, and making sure he was aware of how much damage you could do to yourself if you were to take this kind of thing on without guidance. So he was very careful to guide his people. But the number of people following him, could be counted in the dozens. But by the time, near the end of his life, the number of people calling them Franciscans was, had to be they were counted in the tens of thousands, probably many, many, many more than that. And, the church was worried about people trying to do what Francis was doing and not having the wherewithal. So they painted a typical picture of a Christian saint for St. Francis and sold that to the public. And so by the end of his life, Francis was very, very upset with the church. He thought he had a deal with God and with the Pope. Not the Pope that was no longer Pope by the end of his life. But he thought he had a deal worked out with all these people, and they would allow him he only had one thing, he thought, to leave the world. And that thing was his spiritual practice, the spiritual practice of using narcissism to, his own narcissism to go through a transformation. So it was that was his last trial, I suppose you could say, just before he died. And it was a big one, because he knew that there was something in his method. It was a real method that really could be entirely satisfying to himself, and would in fact transform the world if there were a lot of people living that. And the church had to give him a more standard biography. That's why those legends of St. Francis are so important. That's what the people believed about him.
The legends, as opposed to kind of the cartoonish figure that he's depicted as, with...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the cartoonish figure that made me always hate him. And, yeah.
With the birds and talking to the animals and... Yeah,
well, I have nothing against talking to the birds or any other animals.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's... Animals like to be talked to.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, try it. You'll find out if you talk to animals with a calm, reassuring voice, they'll stop and listen.
Well, I think with the introduction to movies and TV shows like The Horse Whisperer and The Dog Whisperer, and
mm-hmm.
as you were mentioning in the beginning of our talk here today, that it's becoming more normalized. But before we wrap up, I would like to bring in Jung, and you do cover that a little bit in the book, about Jung's breakup with Freud, opening up his narcissistic wound. How do you tie in Jung? Because you wrote this book from a Jungian perspective, and you mentioned that St. Francis seems to have learned pretty much the same lesson that Jung did.
Well, I don't know if I would have said that at the time I wrote it, but...
In the book, you say, after breaking with Freud, Jung found that his psyche pulled itself back together again, with renewed direction and greater creativity. Out of this experience, he developed his theory of the self as the psyche's ultimate principle of organization.
That's right. Yeah, that's right, and that is the case. He had a really hard time after breaking up with Freud, and there are lots of stories about him. For example, playing Indians and Englishmen with his nephews and his son and his nephews, and his on the grounds of his mother-in-law's mansion, and and really doing really foolish things. He was a man in his 30s, and he was risking the lives of those kids, trying to burn down one another's tents and all kinds of really crazy stuff that his mother-in-law had to step in and stop. So that was where he started from, and then he went on. He began to pay more and more attention to what his unconscious was saying, and that led to the Red Book. The Red Book is the work that he began doing after the split with Freud, in order to find out what his unconscious really wanted of him. So, having figured that, and it was by that means, he began to develop a language to talk about it. So the language of a self was very important, that where self is our wholeness. And we can never know ourself completely because it's our wholeness, and we're just an ego. But the point is that you can develop more and more a sense of knowing what your self wants of you, if you pay attention, if you listen to your dreams, if you pay attention to the reactions you have in everyday life. When I say that, I'm thinking of those narcissistic moments when we feel like we've embarrassed ourselves.
Right.
or whatever. All of those things. Jung was, he thought I don't know what he had expected to have happen when he began working on the Red Book. But the thing is that most of the experiences he had were humiliating. It was as though his soul was out to make his life miserable. And clearly there was something there, I suppose you could say, that was close to what Francis had to put up with. He had to realize that his narcissistic reaction to things was his burden and also his ticket to a new kind of sanity.
There's one more thing I'd like to mention before we wrap up. There is a great passage or few sentences, paragraph in chapter 3 that I would like to read because I and a lot of people who saw my posts on social media would like to thank you for this. You say, Jung held that integration and psychological growth occur when life presents one with a challenging obstacle that splits one's consciousness so that one does not know whether to go forward or back, right or left. Both alternatives have their advantages and both their drawbacks. There being no rational solution to the problem, Jung found that if one can hold the tension between the opposites, an irrational solution will finally appear, directed from the unconscious by the mysterious agency he termed the transcendent function. Holding still while not denying either alternative appears to stimulate the unconscious psyche to come up with a solution that emerges from out of nowhere, from the unconscious. That is the best explanation of that process I've ever heard, because for so many years in analysis, my analysts and I would talk about holding the tension between the opposites, and I would swear and get angry and like, what does this mean? I don't understand. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you for reading it.
Did you?
It was most impressive.
Yes.
I sat here listening to it, wishing that I'd said that.
So yes, everyone, in chapter 3, the book is titled The Ecstasies of St. Francis, The Way of Lady Poverty. And I thank you for sharing your insights with us today, Dr. Haule, and look forward to speaking with you again soon, because I would like next time for us to cover your book, Perils of the Soul, Ancient Wisdom in the New Age.
All right, I hope we do it.
Please visit the website Speaking of Jung, that's JUNG.com, for more information on everything that was discussed in this episode. There you will also find all of the previous episodes of this podcast, which are available to stream or to download for free. This podcast is also available on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, and now on Amazon Music. And it will be available later in the week on our YouTube channel, Jungian Laura. You can also listen to this episode on your Amazon Echo device, simply by saying, Alexa, play Speaking of Jung on Apple Podcasts. Just be sure to pronounce Jung with a hard J. Links to Amazon's new Echo devices can be found in the show notes. So with special thanks to the Taylor and Francis Group and to Fisher King Press, this is Laura London, and you've been listening to Speaking of Jung.